In the oral tradition of many tribes, I have yet to come across a tribal member from a tribe that does not have stories of giants roaming the land. And the way, as my father told me, and it was told to him by his father, my grandfather, and passed down, the star people came from the Seven Sisters. The Seven Sisters being what we call the constellation of the Pleiades. The Seven Sisters and also the Warrior's Belt, which we know today as Orion. So from the belt of Orion, from that belt and from the Seven Sisters is where these star people came from. And the star people would come, they made themselves out to be gods because they had power, they had big medicine, like our people say. They were able to do great feats that the people were just astonished by. And so they took them to be gods because that's what they presented themselves to be. In that manner is how they then went and took the women from the different tribes. And from there is where the giant tribes were birthed from. The women did not survive the births of these giant beings. But as these giants continue to procreate and continue to spread across the land, there's many stories of the people and the tribes fighting against them. Sometimes, with good results, sometimes with bad results, until eventually there was a culmination of the flood that came and destroyed the giants off the land. We still have some stories of giants after the flood. Ishtipapa, which was a giant that lived in Georgia among the Muskogee Creek. Ishtipapa means man-eaters, because these giant beings would just come and take a regular-sized human being and just pick them up and just bite their head off and just drink the blood, like popping the cap on a bottle, boom, 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 boom. So they received the name Ishtipapa, man-eater. The origin of them is not something that I know of that our oral tradition goes into. Like who created them? How did they begin? We don't have that. All we know is where they came from, and what constellations they came from to our people. And the giant races, they varied in height. They were the ones who built a lot of these ancient mound structures. We simply didn't have the technology to do it. Did regular sized human beings have the time to do it? Yes. And there are copies of mounds that have been made. Just like there's, the three pyramids in Egypt, two of those pyramids are copies of the oldest one. But they could not quite match the engineering, the architecture, the ley lines. They couldn't do it. So yes, there are mounds that native people have built, but they're a far cry from these gigantic mound structures that the giants built. It is good to mention that the stars, the constellations, the astronomy of the ley lines of the constellations, that's something that was taught to us by the star people. It was knowledge that was given to our ancient ancestors. And the belief was that there were certain times during certain seasons where there were portals that would open up into the spirit world. And markedly, the equinoxes were the main times when this would take place. At Okmulgee, Georgia, in Macon, Georgia, modern-day Macon, Georgia, there's the remains of an earth lodge that is perfectly aligned for the summer equinoxes and the spring equinoxes. And so it was believed that when the people would gather there during those times, that those portals would open, those doorways would open, and it would open the lines of communication and also for these spirit beings to come through, and whether it was teach, trade, or even take people with them, they would do that.
Very special guest here at ppsreport.com, Chief Joseph Riverwind. Chief Joseph, thanks for coming in. He's got a wonderful new book out. That's what the old ones say. I have read it. It is absolutely a fantastic book, chock full of stories. Let's get into that because I know how 28 and a half minutes goes by, and it goes by really quick. First of all, what tribe are you from? And just tell us a little bit about that particular tribe.
LA, thanks for having me on the show. It's an honor and a blessing.
It's our honor and our blessing.
My people are Arawak, Taino Indians. We're the ones who discovered Columbus wandering lost in the ocean. We were the first ones to be called Indian. The Native American Holocaust, as we call it, began with my people. And we are the original inhabitants of the Caribbean islands and the state of Florida, much before the Seminoles came down in there. And we had prophecies about talking these that were coming to our people. We have an oral tradition that spans centuries that has become prophetically taking place even here, starting with 1492 and beyond.
That's just really fascinating. You talk about talking leaves. I know what that is, having read your book, but many folks out there don't know what the talking leaves are. Just give us a short description of what you're talking about when you say that.
Well, one of the prophecies that has been passed down specifically in my tribe was that pale-faced bearded men, Guamiquenas, covered like turtles, would come to our shores in 3 strange war canoes.
Let me just stop you right there. That's such a specific prophecy, covered like turtles. And of course, that speaks to what?
The conquistadors
Right.
in their armor. And the 3 strange war canoes were the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria.
Wow.
And the prophecy said that when these pale-faced, covered like turtle men would come to our shores, that talking leaves would come to our people, and it would be a completed knowledge, a complete revelation of who God was and is. Traditionally, our name for God in our language is Yah or Yahya. And there was a priest on board that ship named Bartolomé de las Casas, and he stepped off that ship with a Bible in his hands. Those were the talking leaves of our prophecies, because it's the word of God that speaks. And the paper is made from the trees. Unfortunately, as we all know, the horrible history that took place with the Bible in one hand and a sword in the other, and that in itself was something that to our people, although God had prepared our people for the gospel to come to us, the witness that came with the word was absolutely devastating.
It's almost like the trickster got in there, Hasatan, Satan got in there and just messed the whole thing up. What could have been an incredible meeting between 2 cultures became really a disaster for your people.
Absolutely.
And many of the other tribes throughout the United States. And we both know this, and that just even now in modernity, in the present day, there's a little bit of reconciliation starting to happen. Just speak to that briefly, please.
Well, one of the things that's taking place, and I want to mention Billy Graham's prophecy that he spoke 40 years ago. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said that the Native Americans were the sleeping giants. And that once we awakened, that we would be the ones that would bring America back to Christ. And literally this year 40 years has taken place. And there's a huge, huge fire of the Holy Spirit that's spreading throughout Native American communities. And not just our generation. We were just at the revival here in LA, where we saw the next generation absolutely on fire for God. And it's that fulfillment of that prophecy of us bringing that word, but only through forgiveness and reconciliation of these past wounds.
There's in many Native American tribes throughout the United States, they talk about the Star People. Tell us what the Star People were or are, in your opinion.
Well, I can speak from our stories and also some of the stories that I've heard from elders from other nations. In many of the accounts, there's one account that comes from the Mohawk people that talks about there was a great battle in the spirit realm, in the heavenlies. And after this battle took place, that there were those who fell here to the earth. There's other stories that talk about how the Star People would come down, and we're talking many, many centuries ago.
This is like what, 2000, 3000?
3000.
Okay, just a long time.
Ago.
Okay.
And these Star People fell from the heavens, and they made themselves out to be gods. And they also took our women. And when I say take our women, I mean in a relations type of non-consensual way.
Okay.
Oftentimes the women would die giving birth to these giants.
Now, I've heard this before. People have asked me questions about this, the idea of Nephilim, and how if they were women of earth, how would they birth, let's say, a 20-pound baby? I mean, is that what we're talking about? Are we talking about giant babies being born through the women?
Right.
That's what the oral tradition talks about?
The oral tradition talks about that these Star People would take our women. The result of that intermixing, that interbreeding, were these race of giants that then covered the land. They were very sadistic, very evil, for using that word. And some of the physical attributes of them, when we say giants, we're not talking about Homo habilis or Denisovan. We're talking 8-9 foot tall people,
even larger,
and even larger. 6 fingers on their hands or toes, double rows of teeth. Oftentimes, they're depicted in the oral tradition as having red hair, and very, very sadistic sexually as well. The Calusa is one example in Florida. And there's many oral traditions about how they would come. They would take the women. They would also take children, do very sadistic sexual rituals with the children. And then we can see the spiritual connotation of that even today, where Florida is racked with sexual molestations and rapes.
Mhm.
Could it be a byproduct of these
Almost like a
ceremonies?
generational
Almost like
spirit over the
generational
land.
spirit. Yes, absolutely.
You know, what's interesting, folks, is that what Chief Joseph is talking about here is basically Genesis 6, where it talks about the sons of God. Just substitute star people
Mhm.
for that. Saw the daughters of men and took women and married them. And in that exchange, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. And what's interesting about this, according to what Chief Joseph is saying, and you talk about some of that in the book, also that the Nephilim were on the earth and certainly in the Americas. And that is startling. That goes against really the history that we've been taught in our schools. But, you mentioned giants and star people, and this is in Native American oral tradition, certainly in some of the tribes that I've talked to. But there's one account that you told me, which I found very interesting, with two tribes that they made a treaty. Tell us about that.
Well, and when I was in the service, there was a Mohawk gentleman who was also in the service with me. And he was sharing a story from his people about there was a time where the Allegheny, which is where we get the name for the Allegheny Mountains,
Sure.
that was the name for the giant
And this
tribes,
is Alleghenies are where?
up in the northeast area.
Okay.
So
Pennsylvania,
the
New
Allegheny,
York.
right, the
Okay.
Allegheny Mountains. And according to their oral tradition, they had a very huge stronghold right across the river. And so they would frequently raid. When I say they, the giants
The giants.
would
Okay.
raid the villages, taking the women, taking the men. They would easily, grab a warrior, bite their head off, drink the blood. I mean, that's the sheer size and stature of these giants. Well, the Mohawk put out a call to gather the warriors together because something had to be done.
Sure.
And I'm paraphrasing because there's a very specific way our stories are told. So I'm paraphrasing. And as they gathered the people together, many of the other nations of the Iroquois Confederacy did not want to go against the giants
Why is that?
out of fear.
Out of fear.
Out of fear, because also they demanded tribute as well.
Let me stop you, folks. Go back to the biblical prophetic narrative, which discusses David and Goliath. You remember that the Philistine Goliath comes out and blasphemes the God of the Bible, and none of the Israelis of the Israeli army will confront this guy. And this is, I mean, the parallels to the stories are incredible.
Oh, absolutely. And so the Huron were the ones who answered the call. And so the Huron and the Mohawk sent out 2 scouts. And when they went across the river and they came back, they reported, yes, they're giants. They have a fortified city, but with the Creator's help, we can take them down. And so there was a large battle that took place. The warriors were victorious. And as a result, there was a wampum belt. Now, the northeastern tribes, they use wampum belts to record their stories. And this wampum belt still exists among the people.
Wow.
That records the story of the battle against the giants. And then the Huron and the Mohawk said that forever they will be at peace with one another because they were the only two that answered the call to go defeat the Allegheny giants.
Let me ask you something, and this is I just little question popped into my head here. Um, that battle is how old? 1,000 years?
Oh, there's thousands. 1,000,
Okay.
2,000 years
All
old.
right. I'm just wondering if they buried them in a mass grave someplace, and if the oral tradition of those particular tribes, Huron maybe, would know where that burial mound might be.
It's very possible.
Very possible.
I don't know of where it is, but
Okay.
it's very possible.
Cultures around the world have end time prophecies. Certainly, we have lots of end time prophecies in our Bibles, which is what politics, prophecy, and the supernatural report. This is what one of our hallmark words to the show. And cultures around the world have these end time prophecies. What are some of the prophecies that you would like to share with us today?
Well, LA, there's several that also correlate biblically. And for those who are watching, I want to remind the listeners and watchers of Romans 1:20. For those who think, well, how would the Native Americans have known God? Well, Romans 1:20 says, "For I have shown myself to every nation of the earth in things seen and unseen. Therefore, man is without excuse." And so we very much knew who God the Creator was. Not all the tribes were monotheistic, but the East Coast tribes were monotheistic and still are, unlike many of the other tribes that are polytheistic. So the prophecies that have been passed down for generations among our people, whenever we say the time when the fires will come, that's an indicator, especially when we're talking with Native people, we're about to speak about end time prophecies, because one of the biggest prophecies is that once the Creator destroyed the earth with water, and that was to destroy the giants, according to the oral tradition, which is also found in the biblical account.
That's just an incredible statement that the oral tradition in Native talks about a global flood, which
Right.
parallels the biblical
Right.
narrative.
And
That's
these
amazing.
and these are pre-missionary contact
Right.
stories,
Pre-Columbian.
pre-Columbian.
Okay.
And so when we say that the fires come, we know that there was a destruction of the earth by water, and there's going to be a destruction of the earth by fire before Creator comes to restore the world, because fire purifies. So there's prophecies that said that when grandmother spider's web covers the earth, that's an indicator of the fires are really close to coming. What is that to us now? The World Wide Web. We see the internet, also power lines that are going across everywhere. That looks like a web completely covering the land. Another prophecy, and this was one that I really didn't understand until Creator gave me revelation on it, and it was that the buffalo would cover the land again. And in the natural mind, I'm thinking, how is that possible with all the cities and towns and everything that's been settled over 500 years? It is impossible for the buffalo to cover the land again. But then a few years ago, the U.S. Mint put out the buffalo nickel coin again.
Wow.
So here we have the buffalo covering the land again. The Hopi prophecies of the gourds of fire that are going to fall from the sky, and then the lakes will burn and boil.
What does that sound like to you?
Sounds like to me like an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, a nuclear missile. So seeing something 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago of technology that's up today, that's how
very difficult to, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So they describe them as gourds. So we see a lot of this taking place. We see the World Wide Web. We see the iron snake, or the snake of metal, that would also cover the land of the Americas, of Turtle Island, and that was the railroad. So many of these prophecies have come to pass already, and there's still more that we're waiting to happen. But we know that we're at a time where time is short, which is one of the reasons why I wrote this book. During my time in the service, I wasn't walking with the Lord. I wasn't walking with God. My father was a pastor for 30 years.
Wow.
And I decided, in my own wisdom, because of my own hatred and bitterness towards the Spanish and the Europeans for what they did to my people, I said, you know what, forget all this, forget Christianity, forget the Bible. I'm going to go back to the traditional ways of my people. And in doing so, I was able to participate in ceremonies from tribes across the land. And I kept hearing these same stories that were right out of the Bible. For example, the Choctaw. The Choctaw have a story about when Creator came to a man named Nuah and told him to build a large canoe and put 2 of every animal in that canoe, because the earth would be covered with water.
Amazing.
And again, this is pre-missionary. These stories go way back, but we can't be surprised, really.
We talk about the oral tradition, and what's amazing to me is that many anthropologists and archaeologists sort of dismiss the oral tradition, not only of Native Americans, but of indigenous people all over the world. And tell us about why the oral tradition of many of the tribes should be looked at in a very important way. What gives it validity, in your opinion?
I think a great example would be the Quinault tribes. The Quinault have a story about when the Thunderbird fought with the great whale. And as a result of this fighting, there was a great earthquake that shook the coast. And shortly after that, there was a tsunami that hit the coast and wiped away thousands of people and villages. So this oral tradition has been passed on for generations. And it hasn't been until recently that anthropologists, scientists, and even geologists, seismologists, now we know of the Cascadia subtonic plates that are subduction plates, where these plate tectonics are hitting, creating tsunamis. And they went to the oral tradition of the native people and were able to say, look, here's this oral tradition of the Thunderbird fighting the whale, an earthquake that took place, a tsunami that took place. And now with the science that we have today, they've been able to find these plates, that would absolutely validate that oral tradition of how the native people interpreted what took place. So there's a validity there as well. And it's still an upward battle. It's still a fight to get the scientific community to take stock in our oral tradition. One thing that oftentimes is missed is, here I'm paraphrasing the stories, but there are people in the tribes that are chosen from birth to be the story keepers or storytellers or wisdom keepers. When they learn a story, it is word for word. They can't change a word. They can't add a word. They can't add a plural to it. It has to be told the exact same way. So when we're hearing these stories at the ceremonial grounds, we're hearing the story the same way it was told 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. That was our people's way of keeping the integrity of the story intact.
And that person is just tell us how a child is then sort of handpicked and then groomed to do
Right.
this. Tell us about that.
Well, once the children are picked, and it's a selection process,
Mhm.
and those who have the aptitude for really remembering the stories and have the mental capacity to retain these stories, that child is chosen and raised, and they're continuously learning the stories by repetition.
Are there people today in the tribes that you know of that still a story keeper, for lack of a better word? Are
Mhm.
there story keepers alive today?
Absolutely,
Wow.
absolutely, there are. Most people on the outside of the reservations, or the people, you're not going to find them. But it's just like with the medicine men and the holy men of the tribes. Our people know who they are. And I mean, you can imagine, these people that are found and they get inundated, but their whole sole purpose is to keep these stories alive for their tribes. So yes, there are many who
That's incredible. Let's get into the book a little bit. What is one of, and we're already the window of time is shrinking very rapidly, but tell us one of your favorite stories in the book.
one of my favorite stories was shared with me by a Lakota man, and he was a dear friend of mine, also a military veteran. And we were sitting around the fire one time, and we were talking about things. And he wasn't a believer at the time. He was raised very traditional, in the traditional ways of the Lakota people. And his grandfather was a very well known Lakota medicine man. And as I was sharing things with him, and we were talking about these stories, and he says, "Well, I want to share a story with you." And this story was passed down to him by his grandfather, who was passed down to him by his grandfather. And again, I'm paraphrasing the story. So in the story, in the long ago time, there was a plague and a famine that hit the Lakota people. And this is when they were still more on the East Coast, because the
Okay.
Lakota, if you've ever watched Dances with Wolves, that's the Lakota. And he gave me the permission to tell the story. They were used to be East Coast people before they became buffalo hunters and pushed out west. And there was a time where there was a great sickness that came upon the people. So, as is custom of a chief, you would go and you would fast and pray for an answer. And so, this chief would go up to a sacred mountain and, fasting and praying, would cry out to Creator, Tunkashila, maker of all things,
Hmm.
creator of the heavens and earth, my people are dying. Is there a song that you can give me that I can sing over my people so that they'll be healed? And he received no answer. So the next day, the chief is praying and singing. And again, Dunkashila, you who made all things, you created us from the dust of the earth. My people are dying. Is there a plant that you've created that I can make into a medicine for my people? And he received no answer. The third day, again, he's praying and he's crying out, Dunkashila, you are the maker of all things, the creator of the universe. You who set the stars in place and the moon and the sun. My people are dying. Is there a dance that you can give me a vision of that I can dance in warfare for my people so that they'll be healed? And there was no answer. So that fourth day, the chief is praying and he's empowered as he's been fasting and he's crying out one more time, please, Creator, is there something? My people are dying.
Hmm.
And as he's crying out, the Creator sent a spirit messenger to this chief. And the spirit messenger opened a window in the sky. And he told the chief, look through this window for your answer. And so the chief looked through the window in the sky and he saw a man that was pierced and hanging on a tree. And the spirit being said, he is dying, so your people will live. And as the window began to close, the chief said, wait, what is his name? So that we can honor him with a dance and remember that he has given his life so we can live. Because amongst our people, there's no greater honor than to give your life for another.
Mm-hmm.
And the spirit being said, his name is Bright Morning Star. Remember his name.
Wow.
And that's what the old ones say. That's how it was passed down. And that is the origin of the Sundance. And I sit there and I was listening to this story just stunned.
Absolutely.
As a traditional medicine man is sharing this with me, a story about Jesus, about Yeshua, that very clearly, and of course, Bright Morning Star, that sounds like an Indian name. God shows himself to you in a way that you'll understand.
Mm-hmm.
And some people may take issue with the spirit being. But
It's an angel.
what does Hebrew 13
Yeah,
say?
yeah.
Angels are ministering spirits
That's right.
sent to the heirs
Sure.
of salvation.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating story. And folks, I just want to, Joseph, you are a born again, spirit filled Christian, a pastor. And I just want to make that really clear that what we're doing here is we're kind of bridging back into who Jesus really is. Jesus is not the God of the white man. He's the God of all men. And it's important that we realize that. we're getting close to the end, so I want to get into this. We didn't cover this. You didn't cover this in the book, but this is an artifact, and we have come to call this the Nephilim lance. The Nephilim lance. Now, we're not saying that this is a replica of it, by the way, but this is exactly what it looked like. And when we were first presented to it, the owner of the artifact laid it on a table, and Chief Joseph and I were there looking at it, and I immediately picked it up and thought it was a sword. And I'm going, well, this is really heavy. It's very difficult to wield as a sword. It weighs about 8.5 pounds. And you looked at us and you said, guys, no, you're looking at it through your cultural lens. Tell us what happened next.
Well, immediately when I saw this, I thought of the oral tradition of the giants, and in the stories of the giants, they would have these war lances, and the old ones say that these war lances, this would have sat on an 8, maybe even a 10-foot wooden shaft
Okay.
that this was attached to.
Wow.
And they would easily, these giants in battle would skewer 2 to 3 warriors at one time, and I mean you can see just the sheer size of this that would take place. Also, as everybody was thinking, oh, this is a sword, this is a sword. First Nations people, very few worked metal. And when the metal was worked, it was, copper, and it was used for ornaments, earrings,
Okay. And this is a bronze artifact.
This is a bronze artifact. Right. To my knowledge, I don't know of any First Nations tribes that worked bronze, especially to this shape or manner.
And what's interesting here, folks, is that this artifact was found at an abandoned campsite in the wilds of Michigan. And the owner of it saw it laying on the ground, and he picked it up and basically backpacked it out of there. We have had that tested, and it's very inconclusive of testing. I've written about it. But what's amazing, when you saw it, immediately it goes back and gives validation to the Native American oral tradition. And of course, we find that fascinating. There's another little interesting idea with this particular artifact, and it's as a weight of 8.5 pounds. In the biblical prophetic narrative, it talks about the weight of Ishbi Benob's spearhead, I think is like 600 shekels. And when you take the shekels and you convert it, it comes down to around 8.5 pounds. So we find that, absolutely fascinating. And look, is it a Nephilim artifact? We don't know. It's still very inconclusive. But once again, it points back to the veracity of the biblical prophetic narrative, which we find that incredibly interesting. What are your closing thoughts here, Chief Joseph? We're down towards the end here. So what's your, just leave us with what's the takeaway basically on that's what the old ones say?
The takeaway is the stories that I've put in the book that I was given permission to share, with the understanding, the permission that I was given was, and this was across the board. All these elders said the fires are coming, the time is short, the people need to know these stories. And I understand from a First Nations perspective, and I know you do as well, why things and this type of knowledge has been so closely guarded by Native Americans, because we've lost so much. But the intensity of what's happening in the earth today, with the earthquakes and the fires and all these elements that are taking place prophetically, we know that people need to be warned. And even the traditionalists, and I have found many of these traditional medicine people are believers. But they would be ostracized by their people.
Sure.
If they said that. But in order to really be traditional, they have to believe the old stories that were passed down from their tribes. But I believe that as First Nations, we have a mandate. And I'm not just talking about Billy Graham's prophecy, but we have a mandate to be the ones that call for forgiveness and reconciliation, because time is short and our Messiah is coming through soon. The chief cornerstone, Yeshua, is coming. And we need to get past all these divisions, all this junk that's getting in the way of us really being a unified body. Jesus, Yeshua, is not going to come back for a dismembered bride. And I believe as First Nations people, as a healed people, through forgiveness, through reconciliation of what's taken place, that we truly can bring the sacred fire, is what we call. We're one small voice in the wilderness, but we were also the last people to be evangelized, the indigenous people of the Americas.
Wow.
And so we have that mandate to take the gospel back to the people that brought the gospel to us and say, look, we're a healed people and we're a reconciled people. We're a redeemed people. We must do this. And we're seeing that happen. We're seeing this revival that took place, which is why we were here on April 9th. 120 Native people with drums and with shofars came together at the Colosseum, and we released that sound and crying for revival in America. And I really believe that the Lord is listening to that heart's cry, because for those of us who have been hurt the worst, we can love the most through that forgiveness and reconciliation.
Thank you so much for that. Folks, that's what the old ones say. Chief Joseph Riverwind, and also assisted by his lovely wife, Dr. Laura Lynn Riverwind. So here's how to order this book. It's absolutely a great read. Fascinating, Chief. Thanks so much for coming on the record with us. Really.
There were giants in the earth in those days, and when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children, the same became mighty men, which were of old men of renown. The Maya and Incas of South America believed a race of giants existed on Earth before the Great Flood. So did many other ancient civilizations. Some took them for gods, others left likenesses of them in stone or wrote about them in their histories. The Greeks and Romans told of blood falling from heaven and landing in the lap of the earth goddess Gaia, who gave birth to the Titans, a race of fearsome giants. Perhaps the most famous of all was Goliath, the Philistine, one of 5 giant brothers. Vendell Jones is an archaeologist with a style of his own. He spent a lifetime tracking down Goliath and the Ark of the Covenant, with which the Jewish holy book of the Midrash tells us the giant made off.
Goliath thrashed his way through the Israeli soldiers, ran over and scooped the ark up on his shoulder, slew Pinchas and Hopha, and took the ark back to the camp of the Philistines.
It was in this field, 15 miles southwest of present-day Jerusalem, that legend says Goliath was finally slain. Not by a giant warrior like himself, but by a puny boy, David, who, as this 9th century BC tablet indicates, would later become king of the Israelites.
David reached into his script. He pulled out this black thing with long leather straps, and he put it on his arm and wrapped it like this, and said, "You have come against me with a buckler and the armor and a shield and a sword, but I'm coming against you in the name of the Lord God of Israel." Then he reached in and pulled out another set of leather straps, but this one had a stone in it. And like this, the shepherd boy cracked Goliath, stunned him. He didn't kill him. Goliath fell on his hands and knees. David ran over and took the sword of Goliath, this enormous sword that had killed Hophri and Pinchas. And with Goliath's sword, he decapitated him.
Just 2 miles from where the famous fight took place stands an 80-foot overgrown mound. This is believed to be Goliath's final resting place, though no one knows for sure because it's never been excavated. In the American Midwest, there are also many large mounds, which are said to be graves. An author who has sold over 15 million books and written extensively on giants is Brad Steiger.
Mass graves of giants were opened. Some of the men 8 feet tall, some of the women 7 feet tall, some records of men 10 feet tall, and extremely large skulls. And extraordinarily, some of these skulls had horns, some had extra rows of teeth, some had other what we would call anomalies, but they were extraordinarily large skulls and extraordinarily large people.
A maverick archaeologist who has long been fascinated by legends of American giants is David Hatcher Childress.
A number of mounds in the Midwest in America were excavated starting around 1850. And in many cases, they would find skeletons of people who were in excess of 7 feet tall. And in many cases, they had double rows of teeth as well as, in some cases, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot.
The one that was found in Bridal Veil Falls, California by a group of miners, first they found this wall with very intricate hieroglyphics. They assumed that they were finding gold behind the wall. They broke it down and they found this woman holding a child covered with fur and a strange kind of dust. The same tall female mummified remains have been found in Texas. They have been found in Death Valley. They have been found in other parts of California.
These old photographs and newspaper clippings are all that survive of these mysterious giants. Winner of the Newsmaker of the Year award, journalist Jim Mars has a special interest in speculative science.
Archaeology at that time was in a heyday. There was everybody that had a shovel was out trying to find something. But what's interesting is that the finding of these giant mummified bodies and giant fossils and bones, really, you can't pin to any particular location. They were finding them in Greece, they were finding them in Italy, they were finding them in the Middle East, they were finding them in America. And even if you write off a few of those as perhaps a hoax or a misinterpretation of something else, you're still left with a tremendous amount of evidence to show that there were these giant beings at some point walking the earth.
In 1912, ranchers started coming to this isolated cave near Lovelock, Nevada, to dig out bat guano for fertilizer. Inside, a surprise was waiting for them.
They began excavating the 10 to 15 feet of guano that was here in this cave. They started discovering some unusual artifacts. They found duck decoys and baskets, other things for hunting and fishing in the nearby lake that's now drying up. But then they made some very unusual discoveries, and those were of red-haired giants that were mummified. These giants were 6.5 to 7 feet tall. In many cases, they were mummified, wrapped up like Egyptian mummies, and they had long red hair going down to their shoulders. The ranchers couldn't explain it. It was the strangest thing they'd ever seen. But the Paiute Indians who lived around here knew all about it. In fact, back in 1883, Sarah Winnemucca, a Paiute Indian princess, had written a book called Life Among the Paiutes. In that book, she talked all about the giant, red-haired people who used to live around this lake and live in this cave. She claimed they were cannibals.
That tribe would eat the dead. They would make war on my people. My people went to work and gathered wood to fill up the mouth of the cave. At last, my people set it on fire and called out to them, "Give up or you will die." But no answer came.
Now, one of the great mysteries of the West is what happened to these giants? There was nearly 60 skeletons brought out of this cave, but today they're nowhere to be found. Is it that there is some kind of archaeological cover-up that has occurred here? Something that concerns giants?
Perhaps the entire story may be a rural legend, or like tons of buffalo bones, the remains may have been burned and used with the bat guano as fertilizer. Whatever the explanation, proof that there were giants here has disappeared. Yet at the same time, tantalizing clues to their existence can be found all over the world. In South America, there are giant figures carved into rock so huge that at ground level it's hard to tell what they depict. Though from the sky, that becomes dramatically clear. This one in Chile, known as Cerro Unitas, at over 300 feet high, is believed to be the largest representation of a human-like figure in the world. Who carved it and why remains a mystery. Half a world away in the United Kingdom, other giant figures stare up into the sky. This one is known as Cerne Abbas near Shaftesbury. Cut into the chalky hillside, no one knows how long ago, it may represent the mythical hero Hercules. 160 miles away, the Long Man of Wilmington, 280 feet from head to toe. It emerges from the English hillside like a giant god from another era. Britain is crowded with such sites associated with giants. An authority on English folklore and the giants of Britain is Jennifer Westwood.
In the beginning, in Britain, it was inhabited only by giants. And in those days, it was called Albion. And after the fall of Troy, a hero called Brutus came here with all his men and decided to conquer Albion. And so they battled for a bit with all these very savage giants, and they slew most of them. But there was one called Gog-Magog that they kept alive, 12 foot high, and he had a wrestling match with the Duke of Cornwall called Coroneus, and first one got the upper hand, and then the other got the upper hand, and then Gog-Magog broke some of Coroneus's ribs, and he got so enraged that he just picked up this 12-foot giant, and he ran to the coast, and he threw him over the cliff, and the giant was smashed on the stones below, and his blood stained the rocks red.
Giants also figure in the mythology of Stonehenge, arguably the most famous megalithic structure in the world. These massive standing stones, the largest 30 feet tall and weighing 50 tons, were erected here thousands of years ago. The early Britons called the stone circle the Giant's Dance and believed giants had built it. Who really built Stonehenge and how they did it are enduring mysteries. Perhaps in the end, we have to turn to legends for an answer.
This was somebody in the past with a technology that we don't have, or a magical skill we don't have, creating these things.
The spiral-shaped Gilgal Rephaim is situated in the Golden Heights, 50 miles from Damascus. Constructed from an estimated 40,000 tons of loose rocks, it is remarkably reminiscent of Stonehenge. Both have been dated at around 5,000 years old and have similar megalithic stones. And like Stonehenge, Gilgal is also said to be associated with giants. Only in this case, there's biblical text which seems to support the claim. Israeli archaeologist Daniel Herman is investigating the newly opened grave.
This is a tomb of someone obviously a very powerful man. Look at the size of the stone slabs used. This must have taken an enormous amount of time and effort to construct. When the Israelites came here and wrote their Bible, it was already here. They saw it. So they have documented the identification of the site by saying that this region was ruled by Og, king of the Bashan. Og is described in the Book of Deuteronomy as, and I quote, "For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the Rephaim." Rephaim is Hebrew word for giant.
The surface of our planet is strewn with gigantic constructions dating back thousands of years. They're in the deserts, on the plains, under the oceans, high on the mountains, like those in South America.
I think the world looked like the cities we see in Machu Picchu, Tiahuanaco, Sacsayhuaman. I think it was a world peopled by giants who structured their buildings out of massive building blocks, 500-ton, 250-ton blocks.
Massive ruins, the scale of which stagger the imagination, are found throughout Central and South America. Even a skeptic might be tempted to ask, who could have built these architectural wonders, if not a race of giants? People of the Mediterranean island of Malta have an ancient belief that their island was known as the last stronghold of the giants of Europe. An explorer who has made a lifelong study of megalithic structures is the best-selling author of The Eyes of the Sphinx, Eric von Daniken.
Malta has gigantic temples. They date really back to the past. Nobody knows exactly, but 5,000 years at least BC. And one of the temple in Gozo still today has the name, the Temple of Giant, Gigantia, they call it there.
A local legend says the temple was built by the giantess Sansuna.
The blocks are so huge, so heavy, that no normal human being could have moved it. In Bolivia, only 30 kilometers from Lake Titicaca, there are gigantic stone platforms all over the place. The largest of it was once 29 meters long. Its weight has been calculated with 900 tons. Now, this is on a place where we are 4,100 meters high in the Andes, which means there are no trees, no wood, nothing. It is not possible to transport a 900-ton platform without any wooden rollers. Even with wooden rollers. It would be extremely complicated. So these facts are here. You can see them, touch them, photograph them, but there is no explanation for it. For sure, the pre-Inca Indians, the Aymara, were not able to move it. So what is it? What's the result? We don't know. On many places on Earth, we find structures which could be related or to ETs, to a technology which we do not understand, or to giants.
ETs, giants, a secret technology? Believers take it in their stride. Here's the best-selling author of Architects of the Underworld, Bruce Rux.
The architects are that race or those races who built all the megaliths in the old world, the pyramids, Stonehenge. They are the people who walked before us, the ones who inhabited this world before we did. We have called them gods. We sometimes call them giants. They left their handiwork behind, and we have not been able to duplicate it. We've only reached the point now where we can really appreciate it.
In Lebanon, 44 miles from Beirut, are the imposing ruins of Baalbek. There is mention of this place in the Old Testament's Book of Kings.
Baalbek in particular is a very good example. That has the trilithon. Those are the largest stones in the world ever used for construction. They're so large we don't even know their actual weight. Those stones were somehow quarried, moved 5 miles, lifted 25, 30 feet in the air, and placed together so closely that you can't fit a razor blade or a piece of paper in between them. We have no idea how they did it. We don't have a crane in the world that can lift weights anywhere near what those things are.
No one knows for sure, but according to Arab tradition, the earliest temples were built here after the Great Flood by a tribe of giants for the biblical king Nimrod. But what exactly do we mean by the word giant? Bloodthirsty monsters like the one-eyed Cyclops of Homer's Odyssey? Or the fee-fi-fo-fum ogres of children's fairy tales? Or could it also include peaceable giants, living as you and I do, walking the streets of our cities in the full light of day?
There are really two kinds of people who could be considered giants. There are giants who are genetically programmed to be tall, people who are normal, but their genes mean that their genes lead them to be very, very tall. And then there are people who suffer from some kind of a disorder, the most common of which, or at least the most well-known of which, is acromegaly, which is a disease in which there is too much growth hormone produced. And acromegaly has a lot of effects on the body. It not only leads to excessively tall people, but it also leads to potential problems with the skeleton and potential problems with some of the organs inside. Ryan is a healthy, well-proportioned, 7-foot-tall, normal young man. I just wish I were as tall as he was.
But what makes a person unusually tall? Is it a family trait, nutrition, or something else? Are tall people just ordinary people of exceptional height? Certainly, some tall people are giants in their profession, and if that happens to be basketball, they may be millionaires too. Genuine giants didn't always do so well. Here's Jack the Giant Killer presenting his latest capture to the king. Towards the end of the 19th century, this 9-footer was given to the Russian Tsar as a gift. For some of the vertically unchallenged, it was possible to make a modest living by displaying themselves in public. From there, it wasn't very far to the Carnival Freak Show, which wasn't complete without one or more giants. Even after death, they could still draw a crowd. Anna Swan and her husband Martin, both 7.5 feet tall, went on tour as the world's tallest married couple. It probably took 2 storks to deliver their 24-pound newborn. Which brings us back to the question, where do they come from? Is it possible that in the dim and distant past, they can trace their ancestry to a race of giants? The Weizmann Institute's award-winning scientist, Dr. Marvin Antleman, believes he has the answer.
If we all have genetic material from the first man, then it is not surprising to find here and there that you would have a giant existing among us today, because there would be a recessive gene that would produce such a person.
The Watusi tribe, for instance, are very large. The median height for most of their males is close to about 7 feet. They're extremely tall.
There are biblical references to even taller people who lived in ancient times. Rabbi Itzhak Mamostin of the Center of Jewish Studies in Vancouver, Canada.
It seems quite clear because of the references in Genesis and later on the book of Numbers and also in Deuteronomy, which are all fairly consistent with each other, that there were gigantic beings that seem to stem from pre-flood era.
Is it possible that environmental conditions of past ages favored the development of giants? Certainly we know from fossil evidence that some species, like dinosaurs, grew many times larger than they do today. A supporter of this thought-provoking and controversial theory is Dr. Carl Bohr.
Optimal genetic expression means the best that the organism has within the DNA is expressed because of favorable atmospheric conditions.
Based on fossil evidence, trees like the California giant sequoia grew much larger than they do today. One theory explains this by proposing that environmental conditions in the distant past were more conducive to gigantic growth.
Under these described conditions, plants and animals would live longer, be much larger, and that's precisely what we find in the geologic column in the fossil record. Plants were much larger, all living systems were larger. We have animals that today have an 8 or 9 foot stature with a 16 to 20 foot stature. We have insects such as the dragonfly. Today, the dragonfly has perhaps a 4-inch wingspan. In the fossil record, his counterpart, Meganeuropsis, had up to a 5-foot wingspan. Everything was larger in the past.
I'm of the opinion that under better atmospheric conditions, people were living not only longer, but they were taller, much taller.
Giants and dinosaurs could not exist today as they did in the past because the atmospheric conditions simply will not permit it.
We had a greater ozone layer at the time prior to the flood. At the time of the flood, it was diminished to about 1/7 of what it was at that time, and therefore, life on this earth as we know it no longer has the same life expectancy as it did at the time of the flood.
A thinning of the ozone layer means less protection from the ionizing radiation from space, and less protection for plants and animals.
Being interested in Earth's original conditions, after 35 years of research on those parameters, I've attempted to reconstruct that context. And in so doing, I've had our engineers build a biosphere that doubles the atmospheric pressure, that increases the electromagnetic energy, that increases the ratio of oxygen, but not to the level of toxicity, that eliminates ultraviolet radiation, etc. And experiments that we've run have been very gratifying. In our controlled scientific experiment, we have measured the effects of a pulsed electromagnetic field on biological systems. We have these Pacu piranha fish that normally at 3.5 years of age are about this size under optimal conditions. Yet we have them now in excess of 20 inches, weighing just under 5 pounds each. Under these controlled conditions, we have succeeded in producing giantism at an accelerated rate.
Taken at face value, the research looks persuasive, though it has not yet been replicated by other scientists.
The conclusion in the tradition seems to be fairly clear that gigantic beings were existing at one time, and that as human history developed, or physiological, emotional, spiritual changes took place, those beings who survived seemed to be of a smaller gene pool, but the possibility that there were other strands of humanity, as it were, seems to be almost explicitly stated in the Bible itself.
In the book of Numbers, we are told that after wandering in the desert with his people, Moses sent out scouts to find a place where they could settle. The scouts went north to Hebron. On their return, they reported, "All the people we saw there are men of gigantic size. We felt no bigger than grasshoppers, and that is how we looked to them." The tribes continued northeast to Mount Seir, known today as Petra in Jordan. But that too, as mentioned in the Bible, had been settled by giants. Wherever they looked, it seemed they found the remnants of giants.
If we look at Scripture, there were giants in the earth in those days. And if we take that literally rather than symbolically, that there were simply men of great powers and extraordinary abilities, then we could say that the first men, the first humans, were giants. Or we could theorize that these giants came from somewhere else and used Earth as a colony.
In itself, this notion is a startling idea. But a people more ancient than the Israelites believed the very same thing. They wrote that the giants were celestial beings who came not from Earth, but from another planet. This is the battleground of the Gulf War. We know it as Iraq. In the distant past, several great civilizations sprang up here. One of them, Babylon, was legendary for its wealth and splendor. But long before Babylon, as long as 6,000 years ago, another remarkable civilization evolved. Its people were the Sumerians, who had an extraordinarily advanced culture.
Their list of first just almost sounds like a whole list of our old society. They had the first bicameral Congress, they had the first writing, they had the first school systems, and you just go on and on and on. So you have to ask, well, where did all this come from? And I think that you need to turn to the ancient Sumerians themselves and listen very carefully to what they have to say, because what they have to say, not just in one place, but over and over and over again, is that they were taught civilization by these beings that came from the heavens to the earth. They call them the Anunnaki.
The Sumerians wrote down their history on clay tablets like these, which lay ignored in a Berlin museum for half a century. Few people have been able to decipher this ancient language, but one of them is Zechariah Sitchin.
The writings and the pictorial evidence left behind by the Sumerians going back 6,000 years speak and depict people who came from another planet called Nibiru. And many of the depictions show them much bigger, at least by a third, perhaps more than the average human being. So they were giants.
This Sumerian cylinder seal from a Berlin museum is astonishing for several reasons. First, it depicts our solar system with the sun at the center and the planets arrayed around it, a fact not known to European science till around 300 years ago. It also shows the planet Pluto, which we didn't discover till 1930. And amazingly, there's another planet, which the Sumerians called Nibiru and believed that it was from where the Anunnaki, or celestial giants, came from.
If you look at the three figures depicted here, they all look more or less the same size. But if you bear in mind that this figure of the deity, that he is seated, and you add from the knee to the hip to his size, you will realize that he is about 10 feet tall, a giant, one of those who from heaven to earth came.
Looking for signs of extraterrestrial life, astronomers have searched deeper and deeper into the universe. But all along, maybe they should have been looking closer to home. For it's in our own solar system that a mysterious object has recently been detected, near where the Sumerians placed their planet Nibiru, home of the Anunnaki. For the believers, this is convincing evidence that the celestial giants are real.
The ancient Sumerian text, just in a very broad overview, basically tell us that more than 400,000 years ago, that these Anunnaki came from space and landed on the earth in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. They began to set up a colony that they called Eden.
According to Genesis, Eden, or Eden, is where Adam was created from dust and Eve from one of his ribs. Others, however, have a more high-tech version of how human life began.
In time, needing manpower, needing workers, jumped the gun on evolution using genetic engineering.
They took the sperm of one of the Anunnaki, mixed that with the ovum of a primitive humanoid, probably one of these primitives that we are now finding archaeological remains of in Africa, the famous Lucy. And they produced a hybrid which eventually became Cro-Magnon or modern man.
Legend has it that when the Anunnaki came back after several thousand years to see how their genetic handiwork had turned out, they found the Earth females irresistibly
It starts in the Bible. There you can read, in the beginning at Moses, when the sons of the gods saw that the daughter of man were beauty, they took them to wife. Later, out of the body's womb, giants came.
So destructive were these titans that the Anunnaki who fathered them decided to destroy them. The apocryphal book of Baruch even tells us how many giants were wiped out.
The book of Baruch says, then the Lord created the great flood, destroyed all life, which then was on earth, including the 4,090,000 giants.
As the story goes, some of the titans survived, but their reign as rulers of the earth was over, and humans became the dominant species. Still, the giants live on in memory, like something deep-rooted that comes from the beginnings of our existence. For some, this is far more than a simple memory. Perhaps they are the ones who report more and more encounters with giants emerging from UFOs. These believers will assure you that the Anunnaki or celestial giants are coming back. The town of Yatzitz is 25 miles west of Jerusalem. On January the 3rd, 1996, Chief of Security Herzl Constantini was at home when he heard a strange noise outside.
When I opened the door, I was paralyzed with fear. I saw a gigantic being around 5 feet wide and 11 feet high. I estimate its weight at about 2 tons. I called the police, and 2 officers came over to the house. They laughed at us and accused me of drinking. But when the trackers came and saw the prints, they stopped laughing. The tracks led right across my field. Many of them were 14 inches deep.
Over the past 10 years, reported sightings of UFOs with giant occupants have been on the increase. Former director of the British UFO Research Association, Jenny Randles, is familiar with these statistics.
From an analysis of 15,000 encounters with beings, giant encounters have increased every single year since the 1965 period onwards, and we are therefore getting far more reports of giants being seen today than we did 30 or 40 years ago.
The apocryphal books of Enoch are believed by many to be over 5,000 years old. In them, Enoch writes about how he was taken up to the heavens by 2 men of great height. In this celestial journey, he also talks of meeting those who from heaven to earth came. 2 huge men appeared to me, the like of which I had never seen on earth. Their faces were shining like the sun. Their eyes, too, were like a burning light. Then they took me up and carried me to the first heaven. And they fly with their wings and do the rounds of all the planets. They led before my face the elders, the rulers of the stellar orders. These groups carry out and carefully study the movements of the stars.
Enoch is taken up to the sky at least 3 times. In our today's view, we would say he was taken up to a mother spaceship. There he has a discussion with what is called the highest, whatever the highest is. We would say maybe the commander of the spaceship.
In other words, Enoch is what we would call a victim of alien abduction. This might seem like a far-fetched interpretation of a text written a very long time ago. On the other hand, present-day accounts by people who claim to be abductees are not so very different.
The elders were 6 to 9 feet tall. They had white hair, pale skin, almost albino, light blue eyes, wore white robes, and had no shoes on at all. And they could speak audibly, and they could also speak through mental telepathy.
I've checked the owner's manual that came with my brain, and nowhere, even in the small print, does it say that all dreaming will be between the hours of 11 p.m. and 8 a.m. But generally speaking, it is. But what we know is the brain can generate extremely vivid images, extremely real and lifelike things that are hallucinations.
But events in the Russian city of Voronezh can't be so easily explained. In this instance, there were at least 20 witnesses. Could they all have been dreaming the same dream in broad daylight? In September of 1989, something happened in the city of Voronezh, 200 miles south of Moscow, which caught the attention of the world press. For several weeks, strange lights were seen over the city. Then on September the 27th, it was reported that a spacecraft landed in one of the city's public parks, from which 3 alien giant figures emerged. Nothing remotely like this had happened in Voronezh before. Before coming to America in 1990, Ukrainian journalist Paul Stonehill covered the Voronezh story for the international press.
Top Voronezh researchers of anomalous phenomena, who include scientists, geologists, and also some military people, went to the site immediately thereafter. They were on the site on the 3rd of October studying and collecting specimens.
The encounter became a media sensation on national television and in the international press. Drawings of the landings by children who were there capture the event vividly.
It attracted the attention of the media around the world because it was effectively endorsed by TASS, the Soviet news agency, who up until that time had certainly not given any credence at all to this kind of story.
They had the chance to talk to many eyewitnesses, adults as well as kids, policemen, school teachers, students, scientists who had witnessed similar or even differently shaped UFOs. The underlying theme was that giant-like beings exited from strange-looking craft, did some research throughout Voronezh, and were able to get back to their craft and fly away.
For once, we had a genuine large number of people all correlating with one another, describing the appearance of these giants. So it was not a case of you simply believe a witness or you don't. Here, you couldn't fail to believe them because there were so many of them talking in concert.
I was standing not far from the main road of the South Park, and I saw this flying object at an approximate height 250 meters.
It stayed at the same height and did not move horizontally. I was very interested by all that, because it could not be any kind of meteorological balloon.
There was a squeaking sound. Perhaps some drilling tool was operating, like it was boring a hole in the ground.
The creatures started coming out. They did not look too much like humans. They were much taller than humans. They did have shoulders, but I didn't see the head.
He was huge, really huge, bigger than we are. He was a mighty figure.
In 1989, Sergei Makarov was one of the school children who was in the Voronezh Park.
I remember a crowd that gathered around the place. Everybody was scared. Everybody turned pale. I was absolutely flabbergasted.
Denis Bozhenko was also one of the boys in the park on that day in September 1989.
I saw some traces there, and also a strange man. Outwardly, he looked like any other man, only he was huge. A moment later, he suddenly disappeared.
I had no doubt that the UFO and the giants existed, because I saw them. But sometimes when I look back, it seems sort of like a fairy tale.
What we're seeing today is very much what we have seen all throughout history. It's nothing new. Anything going on with the UFO phenomenon today is something that has always been around, and you can find it in ancient mythology all over the world.
We have the legends, and of course, in some cases, we have cave paintings of giant-looking being and even footsteps. I would think something was in the past, and this something was much bigger than our normal earthlings.
Were they indeed our fathers? They were the patriarchs who came before us, that all the legends refer to, the giants, the Olympians who lived before us.
Whether fact or fantasy, giants have occupied our collective consciousness for as long as we can remember. But did a race of giants ever truly walk the earth? The ancient texts, as well as some of the evidence, suggest they did. And is it possible that recessive genes in the 7- and 8-footers that walk amongst us today could be connected to a former race of giants? Now, with reports like the giants of Voronezh, one wonders if perhaps the godlike giants of the Sumerians are coming back. But whether they are real, imagined, or allegorical, one thing is for sure. The mystery and the myth of giants will be with us for a long time to come.
All righty. Wow. You know, there's always truth in pretty much everything. I mean, unless it's all straight up lies, but certainly there was the giants in the Bible's times. Goliath, I believe in that. And I believe us little folks like David could take out a giant too. So no fear. I don't fear any man, no matter what size he is. I don't fear any demons neither. So bring it on, devil. I know where you're going to end up in the end. Oh man! So thanks for tuning in, guys, and watching that with me. The giants are coming back. The Nephilim, the ancient ones, whatever you want to call them, the fallen angels, definitely will return, and Jesus will return too. So, amen to that. I hope everybody's having a marvelous Monday, not a manic Monday. Wow. Yep. So that was the giants there. And let's see here. I think I'm just gonna go ahead and wrap this up. I've got a lot of raking to do outside and hauling leaves off from my front yard into my backyard into the woods. And it's not gonna be fun, but I got to get it done. Again, I really appreciate you all coming through here, and somebody's knocking at my door now too. Oh, come on in. My sister's here. All right. God bless you all, and I'll see you tonight or tomorrow. Thank you.
I parked it over here because your wheelbarrow.